The letter came down to the kitchen with the breakfast tray, folded once and marked with a broken seal, and the moment Eliza Crane's eyes fell on the address, she set the copper pan down so hard the water leapt. She knew the hand. She had known it for 4 years, since the first winter she had carried her mistress's correspondence up the back stair of a narrower house in a poorer county. That slant of the letters, the long tail on the letter G, the way the writer crossed a T high and firm as though he could not bear to leave a thing unfinished. She had seen that hand on 100 pages held in a dying woman's fingers. She had seen it last on the night her mistress died, when the old lady had pressed a folded sheet to her own breast and refused to let the doctor take it, and had whispered a name Eliza had not been permitted to hear. Now the same hand lay on a footman's tray in the servants' passage of Renfield Hall, addressed in ink still faintly wet, to the master of the house, to the Earl of Aldermere, to a man Eliza had never seen speak more than 6 words together, and never once to her. She was 27, and she had been a kitchen girl for 11 months, and she had learned in that time to make herself smaller than the pans she scoured. Even so, her hand would not stop shaking, and she could not have said whether it was grief or fear or the strange, cold certainty that the past she had buried in a country churchyard had followed her north and let itself in through the master's own door. You may already sense what she could not. Stay with her a moment. The truth of that handwriting was older and closer than she dared to guess. She had come to Renfield the way the invisible always come to great houses, through a side door and a word from a distant cousin, with a character reference she had half written herself, and a black gown gone grey at the seams. The housekeeper, Mrs. Folly of Manor and Iron of Rule, had looked her over once and named her fit for the scullery, and that had been the whole of her welcome. Eliza had not minded. She had wanted precisely to be unseen. A woman who is not looked at is a woman who is not asked questions, and Eliza Crane had questions she could not afford to answer. The house itself was the grandest she had ever stood inside. It rose from the Yorkshire moor in pale stone, 3 stories of tall, cold windows, and behind it, a walled garden ran down toward a beck that never quite stopped talking. Inside there were more rooms than the staff could keep warm, and a library that climbed 2 floors, and a long gallery where dead Aldermares looked down from their frames with the master's own grey eyes. For the Earl had those eyes, everyone said so, though few of the lower servants had seen them close enough to know. He had come into the title young and hard. His father dead of a fall from a hunter, his elder brother dead of a fever in a foreign campaign, and then, 2 years before Eliza came, his young wife dead as well, of a thing the house did not speak of above a murmur. The under-servants said the Countess had been gentle and had loved the gardens. They said the Earl had walled off her rooms and not once opened them. They said he did not dance, did not dine in company, did not court, and turned every ambitious mother in the county from his gate with the same 3 cold words. They said many things. What they did not say, because they did not know it, was that the Earl of Aldermere wrote letters late into the night to a person no one at Renfield had ever met, and that those letters went out sealed by his own hand and no other. Eliza had learned that much in 11 months of carrying trays. She had not learned who received them. She had told herself it did not matter. She had told herself a great many things. The morning the letter came down was the 3rd week of a hard November. Frost stood on the inside of the scullery glass. She had risen at 4 to lay the fires, and had blacked the range, and hauled the water, and taken the master's coffee up as far as the green baize door, where a footman took it from her, because a kitchen girl did not cross into the front of the house. All of it ordinary. Then the tray came back with the correspondence for sorting, and the top letter had lain there like a stone dropped into still water, and Eliza had known the hand. And nothing after that was ordinary again. She should have passed it on. She was a scullery servant. Letters were not hers to touch beyond the carrying. Still she stood in the cold passage, with the sheet in her raw fingers, and she turned it. And on the back, beneath the broken seal, she saw the direction written small in the corner, as senders sometimes wrote it. And the name there was not the name of any tradesman or steward. It was the name of a house she had lived in, the name of the woman who had died with a letter pressed to her heart. Rosamount. Her late mistress's house. Written in the Earl of Aldermere's hand, on a letter now returned to him unopened, because the person he had written to for 4 years was 3 months in her grave, and no one had told him so. Eliza put the letter back on the tray, with the care of a woman handling something lit. Then she went to the sink and put her hands in the cold gray water, and stood very still, because if she moved, she thought she might weep, and a kitchen girl who weeps over the master's post does not remain a kitchen girl for long. To the house she was nobody. Mrs. Holt, the housekeeper, called her the workhouse sort, within her hearing more than once, meaning nothing cruel by it, meaning only to fix her in her place, and the place she fixed her in was the lowest. That was the first time the word was spoken over her in the still room, with the housekeeper's back half turned. The workhouse sort. Eliza had let it settle on her like ash, and said nothing, because saying nothing was the whole of her defense. She had not been the workhouse sort, whatever the housekeeper supposed. She had been, until she was 23, a gentleman's daughter with a small competence and a good hand at the pianoforte in a house called Rosemount, where her father had been the physician, and her mother had run the still room herself, for pleasure and not for wage. And when her father died, and the small competence proved smaller than the debts he left, and the house was let and the servants dismissed, a woman named Mrs. Burrs, Verity Ashworth, widow, mistress of that same let house's neighbor, had taken Eliza in, not as a charity, but as a companion, and had loved her, and had been loved. For 4 years, Eliza had read to Mrs. Beer, Ashworth, and walked with her, and carried her letters, and learned that her benefactress corresponded faithfully with a single soul whose letters arrived in that firm, high hand, and were answered the same evening without fail. She never learned the name. Mrs. Ashworth was private in that one thing, and open in all else, and Eliza had honored the privacy. She had only known that when those letters came the old woman's face grew young, and that when they were late she watched the road. Mrs. Ashworth had died in the spring, of a slow failing of the heart, with Eliza's hand in one of hers, and a folded letter clutched in the other, and her last words had been a name and an instruction that Eliza had not fully heard, because grief had filled her ears like water. Find him, tell him, and a name that might have been Aldermere and might have been nothing, and Eliza had carried that half-heard name north with her the way you carry a stone in a shoe, feeling it at every step and never stopping to look. Because after the funeral there had been the nephew, Mr. Crane, distant cousin to Eliza herself, and heir, at law to what little Mrs. Pericorday. Ashworth had left, a man with a soft face and hard eyes, who had arrived within the week, and gone through the dead woman's papers, like a dog through a midden. He had found letters, he had read them. And whatever he read had changed his soft face, and he had looked at Eliza across the cooling parlor, and said that a young woman with no character and no protector was a young woman who ought to be very careful whose secrets she claimed to keep, and Eliza had understood, in the cold, clear way one understands a threat, that she was not safe in that house, nor in that county. So she had run, not far, and not fast, only to the one place a friendless woman can vanish, into service under her own plain name because she had no other, into the great house of the very county her half-heard deathbed name belonged to. She had told herself it was chance. She had told herself Aldermere was a common enough word in Yorkshire. She had told herself she had come north to be safe, and for no other reason at all. And now his handwriting lay on a tray in her hands, and the letter he had written to a dead woman had come home, and Eliza Crane stood at the scullery sink and understood that she had not run away from Rosamount at all. She had run straight toward the one man who could not know its mistress was dead. She did nothing that day. There was nothing a kitchen girl could do. She sorted the letters as she had been bidden, and set the Earl's returned correspondence with the rest, and carried the tray to the green baize door, and gave it to the footman, and went back down to the range. That night, when the house slept and the fires were banked, she lay in her cold, narrow bed under the eaves, and turned the thing over and over. He had written to Mrs. Ashworth every week for 4 years. He did not know she was dead. Someone had let his letter come back unopened with no word of explanation, which meant that whoever had it now at Rosemount, and she thought she knew who, had chosen silence. Mr. Crane had the house and the papers. Mr. Crane had read the letters. Mr. Crane knew who the Earl of Aldermere was to Mrs. Ashworth, and Mr. Crane had let the man's own letter be returned to him like a tradesman's bill refused. She did not know yet what the Earl had been to her mistress. She knew grief, though, when she stood in its path, and she knew that somewhere above her in the walled dark of that house, a man was about to learn a death he had not been told of, and that no one in the world would tell him gently, and that she alone under his roof had held the dead woman's hand at the end. The next morning she saw him for the first time. She had been sent up with coals for the library fire, because the boy who usually carried them had the ague, and Mrs. Holt, short of hands, had judged the master safely at his breakfast. And the library, empty. It was not empty. Eliza came through the small door with a scuttle heavy in both hands and stopped on the threshold, because a man stood at the tall window with his back to her, very still, a letter open in his hand, and she knew the letter, and she knew, without being told, the stillness of a person reading news that has taken the floor out from under him. He did not turn. She might have set the coals and gone. That was what a kitchen girl would do. Instead, she saw his hand close slowly on the paper, saw his shoulders take a breath the way a man breathes who has decided not to make a sound, and something in her that had knelt at a deathbed would not let her leave him alone with it. She said quietly that she was sorry to disturb him, and that she would come again. He turned then, and she saw the gray Aldermere eyes the gallery had promised, set in a face harder and younger than she had expected, a jaw held like a man holds a jaw when the alternative is breaking, and she saw that he had been weeping without tears, the way strong men do, all in the eyes and nothing on the cheek. He looked at her the way one looks at furniture that has spoken. Then he looked again, differently, because something in how she stood, coals and all, was not the way a scullery servant stands, and the Earl of Aldermere was a man who noticed the thing that did not fit. He asked her name. She told him. Liza Crane. She watched the name go into him and find nothing. Because why should it? And she felt a coward's relief and a strange grief, both at once. He said she might leave the coals. His voice was level and low, and gave away nothing. As she knelt at the hearth and built the fire, she felt him watching her, not as a master watches a servant, but as a man watches a door he thinks he has seen opened before. And when she rose to go, he said, in that same level voice, a thing that stopped her at the door. He asked whether she had come from the south. He said her voice was not a Yorkshire voice. She might have lied. It would have been easy and safe. He had a dead woman's letter in his hand, though, and grief in his eyes. And she had held that dead woman's hand, and the lie would not come. She said that she had. She said she had come up in the spring from a house near Harrogate, and she watched his face. And she saw the word Harrogate touch something in him and go still. He did not ask more. He let her go. At the green baize door, though, she stopped out of his sight, and pressed her hand flat to the cold wood, because she had felt her own heart go hard and quick at his nearness in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with it, and she did not have a name yet for what it was. That was how it began. Not with a ball, not with a dance, not with any of the machinery by which such houses arrange their affections. It began with a kitchen girl and a widower and a dead woman's handwriting in a cold library over a scuttle of coals. In the days that followed, the Earl of Aldermere began to be seen where he had not been seen in 2 years. He came down to the library each morning while the fires were laid. He walked in the walled garden his wife had loved and had not entered since her death. Once he came through the kitchen passage itself, on some errand the staff could not account for, and Mrs. Holt near dropped her keys. And Eliza kept her eyes on the flower and did not look up, and felt him not look at anyone but her. He began to find reasons. A book he wished carried a question about the still room. stores that no Earl had ever asked in the history of Earls. He was clumsy at it, being a man long out of the practice of wanting anything, and the clumsiness was its own kind of confession, though Eliza did not let herself read it. So she told herself he suspected her. She told herself he had heard Harrogate and grown watchful. She built a wall of that suspicion and stood behind it, because the alternative that the master of Renfield came down cold stairs each morning to be near a kitchen girl was a thing her wound would not permit her to believe. For she had a wound, and it had a shape, and the shape was this: that she was a woman men found convenient to use and easy to discard, that her father had loved her and then left her poor, that the world had taught her in one hard season that a gentlewoman without money is a servant without a name, and that no one, having the choice, would ever choose her freely when a better dowered woman stood in the room. She had learned it at Rosamount when the neighbors who had dined at her father's table crossed the road to avoid the physician's ruined daughter. She had learned it from Mr. Crane's soft face and hard eyes. She would not unlearn it for a few kind, clumsy questions from a grieving lord. The second time the word was spoken over her, it was spoken up, in the front of the house, where such words carry further. A lady had come to call, one of the county ladies who had not given up on the Earl, though the Earl had long given up on them, a Mrs. Sabine Vane, handsome and moneyed and 30, with a widowed fortune and a daughter to establish, and a clear intention to establish her at Renfield. She had come with the daughter, a pretty cold girl, in ice blue, and she had been kept waiting in the drawing-room longer than a lady likes, and when Eliza was sent up with the tea things because 2 footmen were down with the same ague and the house was short, Vane had looked at her over the rim of a cup, and said to her daughter, not troubling to lower her voice, that it was a wonder what the Earl kept below stairs these days, some workhouse sort with a look above her station, and that a house without a mistress soon went to seed in just this way. The daughter had laughed the small laugh of a girl who has been taught that cruelty is wit, and Eliza had set the tray down without a rattle and made her curtsy, and left the room with her back straight, and had heard as she reached the door the Earl's voice. He had come in unheard. He stood in the doorway with the winter light behind him, and he had heard the whole of it, and his face was still as ice over a river. He did not raise his voice. He said to Mrs. Potter, Vane, that the young woman she spoke of had shown him more courtesy in a week than the county had shown him in a year, and that he found he had no further engagements that afternoon, nor, he thought, for the season. And he stood aside from the door to let Eliza pass into the passage. And as she passed, he did not look at her, which she understood. Only long after was the greatest courtesy he could have paid her in that room, for a look would have marked her, and he would not mark her before such eyes. She got down the back stair before her hands began to shake. Not at the insult. She had swallowed 100 like it. At the defense. At the low-level voice saying more courtesy in a week. At the fact that he had counted her days, that he had marked the courtesy, that he had thrown a moneyed woman and a pretty daughter out of his drawing-room rather than let a kitchen girl be named workhouse sort in his hearing. Her wound told her it meant nothing. Her body at the foot of the stair in the cold, with her heart going like a bird against a window, told her it meant everything, and for once she could not make the two agree. That evening he sent for her. Not through Mrs. Pross Holt, which would have been proper, but through the footman John, with word that the Earl wished a particular book found in the library, and would trust no one but the girl who had laid the fire to find it. And Mrs. Brough. Holt's face was a study, and Eliza went up with her apron still on, because there had been no time to take it off. He was at the window again. The book was on the table, found already, and they both knew it, and neither said so. He asked her to sit, which no master asks a servant. And she did not sit, and he did not press it. He stood with the dark garden behind him, and the fire between them, and he asked her in the level voice how she had come to service. And Eliza, who had guarded her history for 11 months, found the guard coming down, not all at once, but stone by stone, because he asked as a man asks who has himself lost everything and knows the weight of the question. She told him some of it. Her father, a physician, dead. The house, let. The money gone. She did not name Rosemount. She did not name Mrs. Ashworth. She stood at the edge of the great truth and did not cross it. Because to cross it was to hand this grieving man his own grief entire. And she did not yet know the shape of what she held, and she was afraid, still, of the nephew, and the threat, and the long arm of a man who had told her to be careful whose secrets she kept. She watched the Earl as she spoke, though, and she saw the thing she had refused to see. She saw a man listening to her as though her voice were the only warm thing in a cold house. She saw his hand, on the back of the chair, tighten and ease. She saw him once begin to reach across the space between them and stop, his hand falling back to the wood, and she understood that he had wanted to touch her and had refused himself, and the refusal was louder than any touch could have been. He said when she had done that she should not be in his scullery. He said it low, and it was not an accusation, it was almost a grief of its own. She said that she was glad of the place and grateful for it. And he looked at her a long moment and said, in a voice gone rougher than his custom, that gratitude was a poor coat for a cold season, and that she should at least be warm. And he rang and ordered her moved from the under-eaves to a proper room with a proper fire, and would hear no argument, and that was the first of his commands that she understood. Only later, to be wearing the coat of an order. She lay that night in a warm room for the first time in a year, and could not sleep for the warmth of it, and for the thought of him standing at the dark window, and for the letter, always the letter, the handwriting she had not told him she knew. Here is the thing she carried and could not set down. She knew who he had loved. She was nearly sure of it now. The letters to Rosemount in that high, firm hand, 4 years of them, answered the same evening, the old woman's face grown young. Whatever Mrs. Ashworth had been to the Earl of Aldermere, she had been beloved, and she was dead, and he did not know. And every kind, clumsy question he asked, every command dressed as care, every defense flung at a cruel woman in a bright room, was the act of a man reaching for warmth in the dark while a grief he had not yet been dealt waited for him like a stair with no floor. And Eliza held the lamp that would light that stair. And she did not know how to give it to him without breaking him. And she was beginning, God help her, to love him. And she did not want to be the hand that brought him the worst news of his life. And she despised herself for the wanting. And still she could not put the lamp down. She learned the truth of it 3 weeks on, and she learned it by accident. In the walled garden, on a still gray afternoon when the beck was loud and the last leaves were down. He had asked her to walk with him. It was improper past mending, and they both knew it, and he asked her anyway, in the level voice, come and walk, as though it were a fire wanting coals. And she came, because by then the wall of her suspicion had worn to a thing she could see the garden through. They walked the gravel between the sleeping beds at a proper distance, saying little, and he stopped at a stone bench beneath a bare rose arbor and stood looking at it as a man looks at a grave. He said, without her asking, that he had not walked in this garden in 2 years. He said his wife had made it. He said her name once, low, Cordelia, and let it go. And then, because grief once loosened does not easily stop, he told her the thing the house did not speak of, that his marriage had been made by his family when he was young and grieving for his brother, made to a good gentle girl he had honored and never loved, and that she had known it, and had not reproached him, and had died of a fever 2 winters past, and that his true grief was not only for her death, but for the 4 years he had given her of a divided heart, for he had loved, before his marriage, and through it, and after it, a woman he could never marry, a woman older than himself and beneath his family's notice, a widow of no fortune, whom he had met when he was 21 and green with sorrow, who had taught him that he was worth loving when he had believed himself only worth inheriting. He had not touched her honor. He had married, as he was bidden. Yet he had written to her every week of his life for 4 years, and she had written back, and it was the one honest thing in a life of arranged and dutiful things, and it was all he had. He said her name, Verity Ashworth. And Eliza Crane stood in the dead countess's garden, and felt the ground she had feared open under her at last. because the woman the Earl of Aldermere had loved for 4 years, the widow of no fortune, he wrote to every week. The one honest thing in his life was the woman in whose arms Eliza had learned to be loved again. The woman whose hand she had held while it went cold. The woman who had died in the spring with a folded letter pressed to her breast and a half-heard name on her lips. Find him. Tell him. Aldermere. She had run north to hide from a threat, and she had run into the middle of a love story she had lived inside the end of and never known. She did not tell him. Not there. Not then, with his wife's garden around them and the name Verity still warm in the cold air. She could not. He was speaking of a living woman. He wrote to her still. Somewhere in his study, a fresh letter waited to go south, and it would come back unopened as the last one had, and he would grieve. Slowly, in confusion, alone, unless someone told him, and the only someone in the world who could was standing beside him, with the truth. You have perhaps guessed the whole of it now. Ahead of her, the way we always do with other people's sorrows. Hold the guess gently. What she chose to do with it is the measure of her, and it is coming. She kept the secret 3 more days, and they were the worst of her life, and they broke on the 4th by a hand. Not her own. Mr. Crane came to Renfield. He came in a hired chaise on a grey morning, soft face and hard eyes, and he asked at the front door for the Earl of Aldermere on a matter of business, touching the late Mrs. Verity Ashworth of Rosemount, and the name went through the house like cold water. And it reached the kitchen, and Eliza set down what she held and understood, that the floor she had feared had finally given way. She knew what he had come for. He had the house and the papers and the letters, 4 years of the Earl's letters, and he had a soft face and hard eyes and no fortune of his own worth the name, and he had come to sell his silence, or worse, to sell the letters themselves, to a proud, grieving lord who would pay much to keep a dead beloved's honor and his own out of the county's mouth. And Mr. Donne. Crane, going through those papers, must have found among them the name of the companion who had nursed the old woman to her end, and would know that companion had vanished, and might, if he saw her in this house, understand at a stroke exactly how much more dangerous her knowledge made her than his. She had a choice then, and it was the hinge of everything. She could keep hidden. She could stay below stairs and let Mr. Podgel, Crane, do his business, and never once let the Earl learn that the kitchen girl who laid his fires had held his beloved's dying hand. She would be safe. She would keep the warm room and the low-level voice and the walks in the garden, and she would keep them by silence, and the silence would be a lie she told the man she loved every morning for the rest of her life. Or she could go up past the green baize door she was forbidden, into the front of the house where a kitchen girl had no business, and stand before an earl and a blackmailer both, and tell the truth she had carried north in her shoe, and lose everything by it, the place, the warmth, the safety, perhaps her liberty. Crane's threats had teeth, and give the Earl the worst news of his life, because it was his to have, and no one else would give it to him whole. She took off her apron. She washed her hands. She went up the back stair and through the forbidden door. They were in the library. Mr. End. Crane stood with his back to the fire and a leather folder under his arm, and the Earl stood at the window with his face like ice over a river, and neither had heard her come. And Mr. Sicken. Crane was in the middle of a smooth, cruel sentence about how a gentleman of the Earl's standing would surely not wish certain letters, certain warm and particular letters, to become the property of a county that had already forgotten his poor wife, when the Earl saw Eliza in the doorway and stopped listening to the blackmailer entirely. She crossed the room. She had never in 11 months crossed a room in the front of that house, and she crossed this one to the window where the Earl stood, and she did not look at Mr. Primbo, Mitchay, and Crane at all, because what she had to say was not for him. She said the beginning of it plainly, the way you say a thing that cannot be softened. She told the Earl that Mrs. Verity Ashworth was dead. She told him she had died in the spring, in the month of April, of a slow failing of the heart, and that it had not been hard at the last, and that she had not been alone. And she watched the news go into him and take the floor out. watched the gray eyes go blind for a moment with it, watched the jaw held like carved stone begin only at the very corner to break. "Mistering." Crane made a sound of protest, some sharp thing about who this servant was to speak, and the Earl silenced him with a hand not even raised, only lifted an inch from his side, and Mr. Prast. Crane fell quiet because there are men whose stillness commands more than other men's shouting, and the Earl of Aldermere in that moment was terribly still. And then Eliza told him the rest, the part that was hers to give and no one else's, the part Mr. Crane with all his letters could never sell. She told him that she had been there, that she had been Mrs. Ree, Ashworth's companion for 4 years, that she had read to her, and walked with her and carried her letters, the letters in that firm, high hand, and that she had held her hand at the last. She told him Ashworth had died with a folded letter pressed to her heart, one of his, and had refused to let it be taken from her, and that her last words had been an instruction and a name. Find him. Tell him, and the name had been his. The Earl of Aldermere put his hand to the window frame to keep his feet, and for a long moment the loud beck in the garden was the only sound in the room, and then he asked her in a voice she had not heard from him, low and cracked and young, whether it was true that his beloved had not been alone, whether it was true that a kind hand had held hers at the end, and Eliza said, "My hand, it was my hand." The silence after that was the kind that reorders a room. "Mr. Bria." Crane stood forgotten by the fire with his folder of letters worth, suddenly nothing at all, because the honor he had come to sell had just been given away for free by the one person who owned it more truly than he ever could, and the Earl had eyes for none of it. He looked at Eliza as a man looks who has been handed in the same breath the worst grief of his life and the one mercy that could make it bearable. And he crossed the small space between them, and he took her hand, the raw, red, kitchen-scoured hand, in both of his, and he bowed his head over it. Felt the master of Renfield weep at last, all in the eyes and nothing on the cheek, over the hand that had held the hand of the woman he had loved. Mr. Crane tried, from the fire one last time. He said something about the letters, still about impropriety, about a servant's word, about what the county would make of a lord who kept such company below stairs. And the Earl lifted his head, and he looked at Mr. Rass. "Crane," and he said the thing that ended it. The only thing, in 6 level words that carried the whole weight of the man. "This woman is worth every letter." He said it once. He did not embroider it. He turned to Mr. Robble. Crane and he authored, in the cold voice of a man conducting the last business of a bad day, to buy the letters at their weight in nothing, since their only value had been a secret that was now, by his own choosing, no secret at all. He would grieve Verity Ashworth openly. He would honor her memory in the plain sight of the county that had thought her beneath him. And a man who has nothing to sell has nothing to threaten with, and Mr. Trasson. Crane, soft face gone gray, understood that he had come to blackmail a wall, and found it made of stone, and he gathered his worthless folder, and he went. They did not speak for a while after the door closed. There was too much in the room. The Earl still held her hand and seemed unwilling to let it go, as though it were the last warm thing left of the woman it had touched, and Eliza let him hold it, and did not pull away, because her wound had told her all her life that no one would choose her freely. And here was a man who had just chosen her in front of a blackmailer, and thrown away his own last secret to do it. And the wound, for the first time, had nothing to say. He asked her at last why she had come north. And she told him the whole truth. Now the threat, the flight, the half-heard name, the letter come home on the breakfast tray, the 11 months of silence, while she gathered the courage to break his heart. She told him she had not meant to love him. He said in the level voice with something under it now that he had not meant to be loved, and had not been, in the whole of his careful life, until a kitchen girl came into his library with a scuttle of coals, and would not leave a stranger alone with his grief. He said her name Eliza, not Miss Crane, not the girl, not the workhouse. Sort. Eliza, plainly as a man says the name of a person he has decided to keep. and she heard in it the third and last unsaying of every dismissal the house had laid on her. And she understood that she had been seen, entirely, by the one whose seeing could reorder her world, and that it had. They were married in the spring, quietly, in the small church on the edge of the Renfield land, a year to the season from the day Verity Ashworth had died. There was no crowd. The county came in time, because the county always comes in time, and found to its confusion that the new Countess of Aldermere had a physician's education and a good hand at the pianoforte, and a way of looking at cruelty that made it feel its own size. Mrs. Vane did not call again. Mrs. Holt, who had named her the workhouse sword in the still room on a cold morning, cried at the wedding, and would deny it forever. That is the county's story, though, and the county is not where this ends. It ends in the walled garden, the following spring, on a still grey afternoon with the beck loud and the first green coming up in the beds that the dead countess had made and the new countess had chosen, out of respect and out of something gentler, to keep exactly as they were. Eliza stood at the stone bench beneath the rose arbor, with a letter in her hand. Not a letter come home unopened. A letter she had written herself, that morning, to a grave in a southern churchyard, because she had found she still wished to tell Verity Ashworth things, and had decided that the wishing was not foolish but faithful. She read it once in the cold, bright air. Then she folded it, and she did not burn it, and she did not send it, because there was no sending it, but she pressed it a moment to her own breast the way a dying woman had once pressed a letter to hers, and she felt across the year and the miles and the grave the whole strange grace of the thing. That a dead woman's handwriting had come down to a kitchen, on a breakfast tray, and had led her letter by letter, hand by hand, out of the cold and into the warm, into a house that had a mistress again, into a man who had learned twice over now that he was worth loving. The Earl came down the gravel to find her there. He did not ask what the letter was. He had learned to let her keep the things she needed to keep. He only came and stood beside her at the bench where his first grief and his last happiness had both been spoken, and he took her hand, the hand that had held the hand of the woman they had both loved, and they stood together in the garden while the beck went on talking, and the light came slantwise gold across the beds. And neither of them said anything at all, because everything that needed saying had been said in a cold library over a scuttle of coals, and the rest was only the long, warm work of a life. Verity Ashworth had died with a letter pressed to her heart, and a name on her lips, and an instruction. Find him. Tell him. And a kitchen girl who knew his handwriting had done both, and had found, in the doing, that she had been finding herself the whole time. Eliza folded the letter once more and slipped it into the pocket over her own heart, and turned, and took her husband's arm, and walked with him back up the garden toward the warm-lit house. And the last of the afternoon light lay gold on the stone, and the beck did not stop talking. And somewhere in a southern churchyard a grave held its own quiet. And everything that had been lost had been, in the strange, slow justice of the world, given back, changed, and given back whole. If Eliza's journey stayed with you, stay a moment more in the quiet of it before you go, and if it moved you, leave a word behind so that someone else looking for a warm story on a cold night might find their way here too. Thank you for staying until the end.